All right, good morning, everybody. Last week, we completed the book of Matthew in the adult Sunday school class, and by popular demand, I'm starting the lessons on, well, not last week, week before we finished Matthew chapter 28, and we had an introduction to world religions last week, and basically explaining how we should, react to other religions. That one, as Christians, it's not against the Bible, not against God, the serving the Lord, to learn about other people's faiths. In fact, we learned that Paul had a lot of knowledge of multiple different faiths, whether it was the Greeks, whether it was the Jews, and anybody in between, that he took the time to learn about them so he could help him witness better, like he did on the Mount in Athens, where he talked about the unknown God. And I thought, well, that's a wonderful attitude to have, because when you go to another country to be a missionary, it's not about proving other religions wrong. It's simply about sharing the gospel. And like my grandparents learned, that if you can relate to people, they're going to relate to you. And that opens doors, and that's what we're supposed to do. Well, today's lesson is going to be about Islam. Now, granted, this is not going to be a super in-depth, several months worth of study, because you could. Because when I looked at the source material, I'm like, how do I make this simple? Because half the stuff you're not going to remember by the time you leave. But I took what I found most interesting and brought it here so we can understand more about Islam. I'm sure most of us have heard on the news or in conversation words like jihad. What does it really mean? You heard about Sharia law. What does that mean? Sometimes you hear about the Hamas, and of course we've heard in the news for several years about groups like ISIS. Why do they believe and do the things they do? Well, this is what this is going to address as far as that goes. So, Islam is the second largest religion in the world, and it's quickly growing. What surprised me, still the number one religion in the world as of right now is Christianity. But Islam is not too far behind. And of course, when I say Christianity, this comprises all concepts of Christianity. So you're going to get into Catholicism, you're going to get towards all the different sects there. But as a whole, Christianity is still the number one religion, but Islam is quickly catching up. In fact, they say it's the fastest growing religion in the world. Some things I did not know, but that there are right now currently 57 Islamic countries. I didn't realize there were that many. And of course, a lot of them are really tiny. Of course, we all know about Saudi Arabia and such. But what they consider a Muslim country is a country with a large Muslim majority. In such places, some of the countries that I found were, of course, obviously Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, Morocco, Nigeria. I did not know Nigeria was considered a Muslim country. Dubai, the UAE, which stands for the United Arab Emirates, and Egypt, just to name a few. I mean, there's large swaths of Africa are considered Muslim. Of course, in East Asia and in Asia, you have, of course, the Arab nations. And then many of the countries are all a part of Indonesia. Lots of Indonesia. Of course, Saudi Arabia is home to Mecca. For Muslims, Mecca is the most holy city. It is believed to be the birthplace of Islam and is the birthplace of the Prophet Muhammad. According to Islam, all able-bodied Muslims need to make a pilgrimage called the Hajj to the holy city of Mecca. So basically, if able-bodied, I mean unless you're disabled, but as a practicing Muslim, it is required for you at least once in your life to make a pilgrimage, a Hajj, to Mecca. And the city can be a couple of 100,000 people, but during the holy month, when everybody's supposed to go there, it can balloon to several million people. In fact, the Saudis have built these little really fancy tent cities that surround it so people can have accommodations. What I didn't realize until I was looking at this, they actually have a Hilton in Mecca. They have a lot of the modern conveniences, and now even women can go. As Grandma said, when she and Grandpa were in Pakistan, that women were not allowed to enter Mecca, but now, of course, women can. Of course, everybody has to dress modestly. There is a lot of requirements that are enforced there as far as modest dress. Muslim tradition states that another name for Mecca is Faran, of which is synonymous to the Old Testament desert of Paran, of which is in Genesis chapter 21. It is believed that Nebaioth, the eldest son of Ishmael, built the city of Mecca. You know, that's something that we have to think about. All these places out there, you know, a lot of them were mentioned in the Bible. You know, that these places, just like Israel, they had these ancient places and cities and stuff, you know, that you'll find references to them, which I thought was really cool. Now, as far as language goes, Arabic is the most widely spoken language among Muslims, but depending on their geographical location, they can also speak Urdu, which is also the second biggest language, Turkish, Persian, which also makes in between, it can be French and Farsi. And in Indonesia, they speak Bahasa Indonesia, and in some places of Africa, like in Kenya, they actually speak Swahili, which I remember one of my teachers, when she was young, was a missionary to Tanzania, and she spoke fluent Swahili. And I remember when The Lion King came out, that she listened to the music and she would translate what she knew. She said that some of the language is Zulu, which she didn't understand, but she understood all the Swahili parts, which I thought was great. So what is Islam? Islam is a religion that began in around the 7th century in the Middle East. Muslims that follow Islam believe in one God whom they call Allah. The main holy book of Islam is called the Quran, and Muhammad is considered the last prophet by Muslims. Islam, of course, was founded by Muhammad around AD 610. It is stated that the angel Gabriel came to Muhammad and advised him that he would be Allah's last prophet. Muhammad would record his visions, also called surahs, like chapters in our Bible, of which make up the Muslims' holy book, the Quran. There are approximately 114 surahs. You know, when Muhammad, what's interesting about Muhammad, of course, where he grew up in a polytheistic world, meaning that his people worshipped many gods. And he was considered lazy and basically not dependable by his uncle, and was sort of cast out. While he was away, he ran into some Jews who saved his life. And they took him to the city where they dwelled, and he fell in love with the Jewish people, and more importantly, the Jewish religion. During this place was also an area where lots of people would pass through, and he also met a lot of Christians, and he was interested. Now, it was also during this time, it is believed that Muhammad actually basically caught malaria, and he would start having these visions. And what skeptics believe, of course, of Islam, believe that these visions were caused by hallucinations itself. Of course, the Muslims do not believe that. They believe that they were truly visions from God. And either way, Muhammad began to gather people to believe his faith, believe in one God. He was inspired by the Jews, inspired by Christians for one God. And his uncle tried to kill him multiple times, but eventually his people kept growing and growing and growing until they were able to overthrow his uncle, and then they ended up conquering much of the Middle East at this point. Now, in Islam, there are 5 pillars. The Shahada, which is faith. The Shahada is a declaration of faith stating, there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. This proclamation is the foundation of a Muslim's belief. It signifies their entry into Islam. In other words, an individual has to make that statement in order to become a Muslim. They have to believe that and make that statement. The second pillar is Salah, prayer. Salah refers to the ritual prayer performed 5 times a day. Muslims pray facing the Kaaba in Mecca at dawn, noon, mid-afternoon, sunset, and night. The practice fosters a direct connection with Allah and serves as a reminder of faith throughout the day. The third pillar, zakat, charity. Zakat is the act of giving a fixed portion of one's wealth to those in need, typically calculated at 2.5% of savings. This pillar emphasizes the importance of charity, social responsibility, promoting economic equality within the community. Fourth, Sawin, fasting. Sawin involves fasting during the holy month of Ramadan, where Muslims abstain from food, drink, and other physical needs from dawn until sunset. This practice encourages self-discipline, spiritual reflecting, empathy for the less fortunate. And then last, number 5, Hajj, which we talked about, the pilgrimage to Mecca. They believe all able-bodied individuals, so if somebody is crippled, if they can't go, they can't go, but anybody who can should. Now, something that blew my mind was the Islamic concept of heaven. In Islam, Jannah is the place of the righteous in the afterworld, their final and permanent abode. According to one count, the word appears 147 times in the Quran. Belief in afterlife is one of 6 articles of faith in Islam, and is a place in which believers will enjoy pleasure, while disbelievers will suffer in Jahannam, which is hellfire. Both Jannah and Jahannam are believed to have several levels. The higher, the more desirable. In the case of Jannah, the higher levels are higher in prestige and pleasure, while in the case of Jahannam, the lower levels have more severe and excruciating punishments. The afterlife experience is described in physical, psychic, and spiritual. Jannah is described with physical pleasures such as gardens, beautiful houris, wine that has no after effects, and divine pleasure. The reward of pleasure will vary according to the righteousness of the person. Their characteristics of Jannah often have direct parallels to those of Jahannam. The pleasure of delights of Jannah described in the Quran are matched by the excruciating pain and horror of Jahannam. But of course, as my grandmother has pointed out, that they believe, of course, that men will have 70 virgins that will serve them. Now, what's really interesting is that in the Quran, nothing is stated about what happens to women. But most contemporary, meaning newer Muslims, believe that women will also have a pleasure as well. But some of the more strict Muslims disagree. They don't believe women even have souls. You know, it's like, wow, that's crazy, isn't that? But, you know, like I said, the majority now don't believe that, but there are some that still do. We hear, and so what's crazy, it's like crazy, you know, of course, in comparison to us, which we'll get to in a moment when I start talking about how we are different. But it is sad, unfortunately, if you look here, that it's all about what you do. Where you land in heaven is based upon your righteousness. Where you land in hell is based upon how unrighteous you are. And as when the lesson book I was reading was going on, it's very complicated how to get there. They talk you're in a stasis state in the grave, where after everything is weighed, and then it's either you go up or go down. And still, there's also other measures that go on to decide how far you go up or how far you go down. It's complicated. Now, we all have heard the word jihad. Now, jihad in Arabic literally can mean exerting, striving, or struggling, particularly with a praiseworthy aim. That a person can consider jihad as they work to better themselves, to make themselves better. Of course, we hear it a lot about war, which of course is specifically a spiritual warfare. In the 20th century, the notion of jihad lost its jurisprudential relevance and instead gives rise to an ideological and political discourse. While modernist Islamic scholars have emphasized the defensive and non-military aspect of jihad, some Islamists have advanced aggressive interpretations that go beyond the classical text. That means, as written in the Quran, you know, it's not about taking over the planet or waging war with people you disagree with. And as you know, most Muslims, if you ever worked with a Muslim, they're caring, loving people, and they're not out to try to take over the planet as far as that goes. But there are some that take the text out of context. Let's be honest, we also see lots of people that are quote-unquote Christians that use the Bible to manipulate, to justify abhorrent behavior. It is no different. And this is what happens when you have people that take part but not take the whole. But jihad, in reality, is about defense, about keeping the faith, about protecting the faith. Then we move on to Sharia law, also called Muslim law. In strict Muslim countries, the concept of faith and law are one and the same, meaning that Sharia law is the ultimate law. Man's laws are under it. Sharia law is over everything, and then man's laws are under it. Sharia law is the body of Islamic religious law based on scriptures of Islam, particularly the Quran and the Hadith. The Islamic terminology, Sharia, refers to immutable and intangible divine law, in contrast to fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence, which refers to the interpretations by Islamic scholars through madhab, as enacted by Islamic court. Sharia has always been used alongside contemporary law in Islamic history. It has been elaborated upon and developed over centuries by legal opinions issued by qualified jurists, reflecting the tendencies of different schools. Sharia law supersedes man's law in the view of Muslims. Now, what does this mean? So, for example, if you're in a Muslim country, Sharia law is over everything. If you're a non-Muslim, you actually have to pay a tax, which is roughly about 2.5%. Now, with this tax, the Muslims guarantee you protection and equal discourse, of course, under the law, meaning that you can sue a Muslim if you're robbed. You can sue a Muslim. You have equality, but you have to pay a tax. Non-Muslims do not. So you're allowed to operate your faith, but at their jurisdiction. And they said that while most Muslim countries do allow freedom of religion, that if you are held accountable, if you are found guilty by what they view as a sin, you can also be taken to court. Now, what would this be? Well, in strict Muslim countries, if a non-believer was to convert a believer to another faith, it is a death sentence. If a Muslim, this is strict, not all Muslim countries are strict, but the most strict countries, that if a Muslim is to leave the faith, it is a death sentence. If a father, if a child of a parent of a strict Muslim was to leave the faith, meaning they became a Muslim and leave, if they're never made the profession and they become another religion, it's okay. However, if they make a profession and leave the religion, the father or the mother is required to do an honor killing. Now, this is not practiced in all Muslim countries. Places like Saudi Arabia are a little more lenient, but places like Pakistan, it does happen. It's not widely happening, but it does. And that's because they believe that, and this is a reality, folks, when you believe that your destination in heaven or hell is based upon how righteous you are, this is why you're going to see people going out and murdering people, suicide bombing, because they believe, especially like groups like Hamas, Al-Qaeda, and the different terrorist organizations, they believe that the sure way to guarantee to get into heaven is to die as a martyr for the faith. And that's why we as Christians, instead of looking at Muslims out of frustration or anger or fear, we should pity. We should have empathy. You know, the wonderful love of Jesus means that we don't have to sacrifice. God does not call us to sacrifice ourselves to get into heaven. We understand sometimes there is sacrifice. Martyrdom is very real. People do die all around the world for their faith. But it's not expected of it. You know, sometimes, the world hates the believer, hates Christians, and the world will do anything it can to stop the voice of Christians. But God does not ask us to die. Many years ago, when I was working with my cousin for MidFirst Bank, I had a Kuwaiti friend who was a security guard, lovely, lovely man. And he was always curious about Christianity. And one thing that he said, and he was baffled, not really, nothing hateful, nothing malicious, but just he couldn't believe that the Son of God would sacrifice himself for a sinner. He couldn't believe it. And I said, but that's the love of God. Amen. God shows us his love through that. And see, my grandfather was able to win Muslims because he brought things home to them. He understood what they believed, and I talked about it briefly in my last lesson. When my grandparents went to Pakistan, they didn't go to Pakistan to make it America. They understood the Pakistani customs. They understood how they viewed. My grandfather was left-handed. They believed the left hand was taboo and should not be used in formal greetings or whatnot. So my grandpa had to learn to use his right hand. He had to learn to greet people with his right hand, to do things with his right hand, to not offend. It might seem silly to us, but for the Pakistanis, he doesn't want to offend their culture. When my grandmother was out in public, she had her head covered. She did not wear the full burqa because she wasn't Muslim, but she always had her head covered in public as a respect to the Pakistani people. In fact, as we were going through pictures this week of Pakistan, because my Uncle Rick wants to do something with them, you could see pictures of my grandma when she was in front with people. Every time her head was always covered. In fact, she walked 3 feet behind my grandfather. So out of respect to the customs, my grandfather often wore Pakistani dress because he wanted people to see him not as a threat, or he wanted to see that he respected their culture, so they would listen to him. You know, one of the hardest things for my grandfather is when he was invited into a Pakistani home, they'd offer him food. And sometimes that food wasn't that great. But, you know, when you go to someone's home, when the man offers you something to eat, it is an insult to say no. So my grandfather would eat, he would witness, and he would go out and he'd throw up. Did he come back in, eat more, witness? But he ended up winning people. And that is something to think about for a Muslim to convert to Christianity, knowing what could happen. That shows the powerful testimony. See, you have to love people. You know, Jesus told us to love thy neighbor as thyself. To love thy neighbor. You love your neighbor, you know, that means that you're going to have respect for them. It doesn't mean you're going to agree with everything, but it means you're going to love them and respect them. And see, it is the difference that they see in you which is going to prompt them to ask questions. Just like my Muslim friend at MidFirst Bank, he was so interested because he saw that my brother and myself were always happy, always cheerful. We always had a great conversation, and him as a Muslim, where most people look at him like an alien, which was sad, we'd be so excited to talk to him. You know, the broken Arabic that we learned, we would speak, and Swedish knew a couple of words that we picked up from Grandpa, who also picked up those phrases and such from others. And he was just overjoyed that someone would take the time to understand his people and his culture. And that's how we win people. Now, I'm going to tell you something. You're going to see a recurring theme in almost every one of these lessons I bring. That all religions of the world, and Grandpa said this many times, it's what you have to do, what you have to earn, what you have to sacrifice. Whereas with Christianity, it's not about what you have done, but what God has done for you. And thus conclude. Well, I was going to add this. So, but is there anything that we as Christians can learn from a Muslim? There is. And this is what I was listening to an individual talk about it. Like I mentioned briefly during my last lesson about it, that he grew up in Jordan. I mean, he was born in Jordan, but grew up in Canada. He grew up agnostic, if you will. His parents weren't religious. They didn't raise him Muslim. But he noticed he was around other churches, and while he did not reject faith, he just didn't care about it. Well, as he's gotten older, he decided to return to Jordan to view, just to see, distant family and to understand, kind of where he came from. And what he found, even though he did not believe in Islam, but he found that the Muslims were diligent in their faith, meaning they were always active and interested. That he said that when it was time to go worship at the mosque, everybody in the town that he was in stopped doing everything they're doing and went and worshiped. He's contrasted that to Christians in where he was grown up, that a lot of times the churches weren't, unless the weather was perfectly beautiful, the parking lots were empty. That you would have a few cars you'd see over and over again, but a large majority of them were empty, especially if there wasn't anything going on in the church. He's found that they were committed to their faith. That it's very difficult to dissuade a Muslim from their religion. Today, lots of Christians are wishy-washy. And of course, this comes down to, we don't study. We don't go to church. Well, we don't study the Bible. We don't go to church. You're not going to have a grounded faith. And then when you encounter someone who disagrees with you and they manipulate scriptures, you fall for it. See, the wonderful thing about reading the entire Bible, you can't be fooled because you've read the whole book. You can't say, well, you can't be tricked. You know, I know when my grandmother is listening to the radio and she hears a pastor, if they're off on a scripture, she goes, I'm not listening to it. She'll walk over there. She will turn it off because there's no point listening to it. If someone is manipulating the scripture, there's no point listening to it all. Because even if they're partially right, what they're partially wrong on is what's the dangerous part. I had that conversation with Lynn many years ago. He would tell me, well, I'm reading this book. It's really good. They're off on a few things. I said, Lynn, there's no point reading it. Amen. Don't even entertain it. Because if sooner or later, you're going to believe what they believe, and you'll be off as well. And the Muslims, of course, have a real desire for charity. If you've ever been around an actual Muslim, and you've been around them, they are kind. You know, my grandfather, it's like, my grandparents always said, it really wasn't the Pakistani people that ever gave them problems. It was the other missionaries. It was the other, quote-unquote, Christians. But, you know, the Pakistanis, with the exception of a few incidents, were willing to give you the shirt off their back. They kind of remind me, if you ever go down to Mexico, or even in the Mexican side of town, you break down there, you have about 30, 40 people coming to help you. You break down on the rich side of town, and this place called, this horrible place called War Acres. Oh, I'm sorry, no. War Acres. They'll just look at you, like, get out of my way, why are you taking up my time? Well, it's because the Muslims from the ground up are taught to have compassion and charity, which is, you know, that means they care. They're willing to give. They're willing to help the poor. They're willing to do things. That's a wonderful, positive thing. You see, there's a lot of things we can learn from other people. And as growing up with my grandfather, one of the things he always taught me was don't go to another country with the think that they're poor, to think that they're foolish or ignorant. Just because they don't have what you have in the States, it doesn't mean that they're terrible people. He said there's always something you can learn from somebody else. And if you go with that open mind, you know what? You're going to want to get along with people. And two, I said, you will know how to witness to somebody. And so this is, my brief as far as the lesson about Islam. But I thought a lot of the stuff I was learning, I've heard much of this stuff, because this is not the first time I've studied Islam. But, you know, some of these other things just blew my mind, because in the studies I've done was usually about the history and how it was created, all the different battles that happened, great lieutenants that really fought for Islam, like Salahuddin, who eventually would conquer Israel, would come in and conquer Israel itself, you know, back in the Middle Ages. All these different things, but learning specifics, it helped, one, reaffirm what I already knew, but also taught me new things. So it's always good. So next lesson, my next challenge is going to do Hinduism, which is a challenge because Hinduism isn't strictly just one religion. There's lots of different variations to it. Yeah. But it's going to be fun. And I think it's fun. I'm excited. I have all these books and stuff I've been looking at and doing different searches and stuff. And I thought, well, this is really fun. I like studying.
Well, thank you.